welcome to another episode of the Kids Media Club podcast. I'm Andy Williams.
Hello, welcome along. I'm Jo Redfern, fresh from our trip to San Diego and Kidscreen. Normal service has resumed. Andy's in a box up there to my left, and not face to face like you were last week, Andy.
Yes.
We're delighted to have Ed Barneih join us today, with whom I had a chat in the very airport queue to get on the plane to return from Kidscreen.
I'll listen
and we
to you,
thought,
jet
you know
setters.
Yeah, why not? Let's get him on the podcast to have a chat about various things, not least a bit of a wash-up of Kidscreen, but also his new venture, which is very exciting, which we'll come to. So welcome, Ed. Tell us a little, how did you find Kidscreen this year?
I found it to be very interesting. I personally started a new venture. I was going to say full-page spread. I guess that makes sense, right? Like an interview in the magazine on the Sunday when it's released, which meant that, you know, walking into the venue, lots of people already knew that I was doing something new. And which was great because it did a lot of heavy lifting for the conversations that I was meaning to have when I got there. So that was fantastic. And had lots of great conversations. Again, I think it's funny, actually. I feel like there was some wording in the article that made it sound like I had lots of access to lots of money, which may have framed some of the conversation, made me rethink some of the conversations that I had in the following days before on the third day, someone coming up to me and being like, "You're doing well." And I was like, no, that's how I'm trying to raise that amount of money, not actually have that amount of money. That being said, lots of great conversations with creators, lots of encouragement from people that have been doing this for a long time. But also, it's really important to me, as I think you both know, that we help to tell these stories in a new, how I see the world going. They're not really going to come from one or two places anymore. And I think I'm trying to set up, I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I'm trying to set up in a way that helps these stories get told from different parts of the world with the same production value and the same level of importance as the ones that we all have seen, the ones that we would call franchise or IP the last 30 years. And it's just a really exciting journey to go on. So that's great. From a Kidscreen perspective, having been there for like 11 years in a row, you know, I still remember the first 12 years in a row. I would say it was a little quieter than it has been. And I would also talk about the fact that we're moving towards lots of different models of making TV. And I know we've said this for the last 2 or 3 years, but I feel like a lot of those models are kind of fossilizing. They're kind of crystallizing.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're coming together. And so there's a little bit of confidence out there, but there's also still a lot of concern about what the future looks like for kids' TV.
It's because it's not clear. It's scary, right? But what was interesting this year versus last, which did feel like it was a mix of fear and panic and negativity and that old survive to 25 that was trotted out far too many times. There was this steely determination, I think, from a lot of the people I spoke to really face now a very different future and figure out how we're going to get good stuff made for kids, which essentially is what we're all trying to do at the end of the day. But it's just to touch on, before we get to what you're doing with your new company, because I can see the clear parallel, as we were just chatting about before we went to record, about stories can come from anywhere, and that's geographically. But also kids really now don't distinguish too much between who's bringing them those stories, as in broadcast or linear. And I think that's really interesting because you mentioned some research. Well, tell us about that, because I think that's a really great story and it leads into your new venture quite nicely.
Yeah, so I think that the stories around researchers at my last corporate role, explaining to us how they talk to kids and get the answers they need to put into this research. And for me, after an hour and a half, 2-hour presentation, one of the really key researchers said that they are finding it harder to frame the questions to kids around linear broadcast online, without even mentioning any brand names, things that we consider social media versus things that we consider pay TV. And kids aren't understanding the difference, and rightly so. This isn't a slight on kids at all. Content is content. And to us, and we in our industry bubble, we very clearly categorize in hierarchy and put them in a hierarchy based on how much money you can make from what is the profit center for that thing. You could make a show and put it on YouTube, but will it make the same money as if you had it on the biggest streaming platform, for example? And so we have to take a look at ourselves in what we think the right path is to make a show versus how kids are looking at that, basically. And I think people are as well, because I do think in terms of people, especially at this Kidscreen, I see people thinking I had one specific conversation. I did pitch prep and it's always great to do pitch prep because you meet new creators with no sense of how they're going to take their great story to market and how they should. And somebody who's already big on YouTube was talking about how they tried to bang on some doors to talk to some broadcasters, but they're reaching a stage on YouTube where do they need to? Their goals are to become more well-known. Their goals are to sell consumer products eventually. What is the broadcaster's role in that? What will I be giving up as a result of that? And will I be able to still tell stories I want to in the same way? I couldn't give them purely positive answers off the back of that, to be honest. But that's the kind of questions that we're asking now that kids aren't asking, but they're just consuming from whatever is the device that they're on.
Absolutely. I was reminded of there's an anecdote by a stand-up comedian that I saw where he said that originally it used to be the deal that you were a stand-up comic and then a TV channel would discover you and they'd say, we're going to introduce you to this enormous audience. And he said, now it's sort of evolved to the point where the channel will come up to you once you've got an audience and say, we'd like to have your audience and we'll put you on the channel. And he said that it's not as obviously a good deal for the comedian in that situation. And I think that applies to a lot of creators. There are some times where it makes perfect sense to partner with a channel, but sometimes that transaction isn't as an obvious benefit as I think people imagine it's going to be. And to your point about the kids being completely, in some ways, not caring what the delivery mechanism is that they receive their content, you can see how even a lot of the traditional kids brands are kind of following the lead of the kids. So you had Nickelodeon talking about having their new series go digital first on YouTube before they go on their core channel. So it feels like, those forces are really reshaping the industry in terms of and kind of creators and brands, I think, are catching up with audience behavior a bit.
Yes.
We've got a whole industry and business that has been built on the method of delivery of content, hasn't it? You are either a broadcaster or you're a streamer or you were in the digital media game or you made flash games. And so the whole structure, the fabric of our industry has very much been separated along those lines. You've got businesses that were aligned to one particular method of delivery, but then now we've got this situation where we've gone to the other side where our audience is platform agnostic. They don't really care about the method of delivery unless it's the one that they're actually consuming right there and then. And I heard somebody interestingly pointing out, actually, it was Evan Shapiro and Marion Ronchet on one of their podcasts recently, is that if your content is in so many different places, it actually makes streamer and channel brands that very often carry lots of different IP across their portfolios. It actually takes away that distinction. So we've mentioned this in the podcast before. You used to be a Nickelodeon kid or you were a Cartoon Network kid. But now there's content from all kinds of producers spread across all kinds of platforms. It actually takes away that brand identity that channel of consumption, in that case it was Nickelodeon, used to have. Mm-hmm. So how do you cut through in that kind of new media landscape?
It's interesting because as you said, growing with the Nickelodeon kid or a Cartoon Network kid, that you would also always know when an independent studio was making a show, which of those three brands it was for. You could actually say, oh, yes, that's a very Cartoon Network show. That's a very Nickelodeon show. Or that's a very public service show. That one's for public broadcasters somewhere. And the effect of what you just mentioned, things being on multiple platforms, is that we are I don't know, I think it's probably a good thing, is that we aren't making shows specifically for brands anymore, which is great because they aren't the definer necessarily. They also are at a stage where they want subscribers. They want to maintain and grow subscribers, and they'll loosen the reins on their brand to do that.
Yeah.
They will take on content that they feel will hit home immediately. And I would say away from kids' TV, I've seen, I don't know how on this podcast we can mention names of like brands and shows and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Other brands are available.
Other brands are available. I'll give you an example. 2 nights ago, I got back and I looked on, pretty sure it's on Disney Plus. I'm pretty sure Peep Show is on Disney Plus. Yeah. Now, if you'd said that in 2020, if you'd said Disney was launching a streaming service and it's going to eventually have one of Channel 4's like sauciest comedies, right? One of the best of all time, one of the best British.
yeah.
I think it gets overlooked regularly. And someone at Disney obviously knows that, got the rights, put it on that platform. But you can see that they're doing that because they're like, what is going to attract you adult UK subscribers in 2025, right? And the 5 brands that they've got on there, content's not coming through fast enough for that acquisitions person to do that. And so what it eventually means is, I would guess that you're going to start having originals of that ilk as well coming through, and you probably already are on these platforms, which means that the things they were set up to do, the things that they spent 30, 40 years doing in cable, the need for this constant maintenance and growth of subscribers have wiped that away. And I think that's a good thing for storytelling personally, because I feel like it opens up all the avenues for when you tell your story, as opposed to very easily 2015, 2016, you could look at a show and just, me as a buyer at Cartoon Network could look at a show and say, that's not for Cartoon Network. It's really funny, but it's more of a Nickelodeon type show.
Yeah.
That's gone.
It's interesting.
I can absolutely see that. I'm a bit ambivalent on the Disney Plus one, just because, 100 years of brand equity piled into the concept of what a Disney show is, now has to contain Peep Show and Poor Things as kind of things, as things that, aren't obviously Disney. If you think of a brand being in some ways a magnet for reputation and what people recognize and expect, I think there's a danger with Disney Plus, that Disney Plus almost becomes like a Walmart brand, that it has to contain everything, so it loses its distinctiveness. One point I wanted to cut. Yeah, sorry.
Could I just to finish on that point, is about when I said the amount of time they spent cultivating what you just mentioned. They created whole studios to keep shows and movies away from the Disney brand. They owned Miramax.
Totally.
They had brands like Touchstone Pictures and Hollywood Pictures, which in today's world they would just be Disney Plus movies. So they went well out of their way to keep the mouse away from the kind of a Nick Nolte 18 movie,
totally,
or a Pulp Fiction.
Yep.
And to your point, do they just become a holding kind of company that everyone knows that you can get everything from, and it's just the Disney company? So that is the future. I think it's actually unstoppable that they do that in the reach for subscribers. It's just, how does the world react to that? What does Disney mean in 20 years to a kid?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing on the brand thing that I thought of, though, when you were saying that, I can't quite remember how you put it, but you were talking about how there used to be a Nickelodeon brand, there used to be a Disney brand, there used to be a Cartoon Network brand. In some ways, I feel like now we've got like a multiverse of brands that can even shrink down to an individual creator. So kind of everything is its own brand in a way.
Mm.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say, actually, is we've got this situation now where those brands that we were just talking about, the Disney Pluses and the Netflixes of this world, are being diluted to just the pipes, really. They're what bring you the content. It's not necessarily something that is unique to that brand or that particular combination of pipes anymore. And because they're increasingly looking at creators and people like Miss Rachel, who's gone across to Netflix from YouTube, as the future of their content, as a way to sustain those subscribers, as you said, Ed. So it's interesting, in this world of unprecedented choice, does that mean that actually creators are becoming those brands and curators themselves? We see on YouTube, you've got creators who are trusted by their audience now. They're getting to the stage where they're trusted as also curators of content, not just their own, but other people's too.
I think so. I think I agree. And I do think creators both, if you go back to a few years, overall deals that you see for creators, I think there's been a willingness from studios to understand that certain creators come with an audience. I think anything that can bring an existing audience, and I feel like, yes, you're right, creators can do that. And just to go back to your stand-up example, I fully agree with that. I don't necessarily love it to continue, but the behavior we're in now, where we basically see people who've grown an organic audience of millions, and a broadcaster coming along and saying, please, can I utilize that? Can I save a bit of time and utilize that?
Yeah. And just to get into one of the topics we wanted to discuss, I'd love to talk about your company's focus on Asia, Latin America and Africa, and a lot of the markets outside of Western markets. In some ways, in this media landscape we're talking about, where the delivery system isn't as important as the content itself, there's a really unique opportunity for storytellers from different regions to shine. And it feels like it sets the table for those storytellers from other markets. And I'd be interested to get your thoughts on where there are new stories coming from that you feel could really resonate.
Well, I mean, the easy answer is anywhere, right? But then when you come back to it, you start to think about marrying it to a viable revenue stream, right? Then you bring it back to, is it population size? Is it levels of mythology? And sorry, not levels of mythology, the size of the mythology that you're talking about. And then you often bring it back to, I mean, the last thing I'm going to do and brainstorm, I don't have the answers on this at all, is how does the rest of the world perceive that country? Are the rest of the world going to watch stories from that country easily? Or what are the hurdles? What are the barriers to entry for someone believing and wanting to really engage with a story from that country? Now, at kids level, I'll go right back to the beginning and say anything with kids. I think those kind of biases come in as you're adults. You won't watch a thing from a certain country. But with kids, it's culture, it's mythology. And then when you become business-like about it, it's about how can you marry together different cultures to get the widest possible commerciality on the show.
Yeah.
So do you want me to talk to you about specific markets or?
Yeah, well, tell us about your new business and where you're looking to find those stories and how you're going to go about amplifying them, because this is fascinating. And we've seen, obviously, in recent years, young people start to look outside of just West Coast US for their storytelling. And we speak a lot about anime, but anime was the thing that they looked at because it embraced stories about grief or gender identity, the stuff that teenagers are dealing with that perhaps had been kind of smoothed off and rounded off in the traditional Hollywood studio way of storytelling. So tell us how you're going to unlock all of those kinds of stories.
Well, that's great that you start there, because I'm not going to start by telling you, because otherwise I'll forget. But your point is more valid now, and it's about trying to tell different types of story and find the gaps where Western storytelling has fallen into kind of a template, and realizing that if you tell this type of story that's very different, and you maybe don't use talent that everyone knows, and I'd say something as simple as sometimes when you don't use talent that everyone knows, you don't actually know who the main character is, and you can just come to know characters a lot better rather than follow, right? So following those principles, I'm looking at countries that have quite different ways of storytelling, and I know it's going to be quite hard to get some of those storytelling principles to hit in the West. But in my world, what I'm hoping for is a world in which I'm not really engaging with the West, because I've actually had a long career of people kind of saying that is local content for these local people. I'm just reverse backing into the concept of my company. What I've realized over time is that across the markets that I will be dealing with, there are lots of shared values, shared morals, shared culture, shared editorial. My final thing, my time with Netflix, where I could see the metrics of the whole world on a show that just launched, I could see that these three continents were kind of in lockstep with what they watch when given ultimate choice. And I think the metrics of Netflix are incredibly important. If anyone's listening to this and thinks, I'm not a corporate company, I don't really have access to the data that I need, you do. Just go and look at the top 10 of Netflix in any given week. It's quite comprehensive. And with 300 million subscribers, you can kind of get a sense of how the world consumes movies now. Because before that data was available, the world moved on the premise that they'll look at box office data. If they're going to go global, we'll look at box office data. But the difference between going to watch a movie from the West, being in one of these three continents, and going to watch a movie from the West, and the difference between that and asking someone to pay £10 a month or whatever to watch content from another place is night and day. It's absolutely night and day. You are not going home to watch people that aren't like you every night. You might on the occasion, but the vast majority of people want to see people like them in situations like them, and situations they understand. Yes, there's the fantastical element, but even if you're going to space, you might want to see someone that looks like you. Going to
absolutely.
As a one-off, amazing. Somebody can do it. There'll be like always be some kind of, I wouldn't say dominant culture, but as we move to a multipolar world, there will be bigger shows because people have economies of scale and have a richer history of telling stories at high production value. But ultimately, there must be an alternative where people can tell stories about them and they're not just local stories. That you go to one continent, you have this idea, and I'm not in the Western way of diversity where you just like, oh, we're going to space, we're just going to put 5 people together from different countries, and then right, and then it's a space camp, and then we hopefully get buyers from all those markets there where we had the main characters.
Yeah,
like there's better ways to do it.
surely not.
If you dig in, you can actually find that there's a thematic editorial tone that matches in home in like 6 different places, 8 different places. And then you can build story that way. And I don't think that's been explored enough. And again, I'll go back to it and say that there are gatekeepers that won't fully believe in this concept because we're in a very risk-averse time and people looking to hold on to their job. But again, there's a pivot towards movies happening as well, where I do believe that families are much more likely to listen to a new story in a movie, and buyers and acquisitions people are looking for movies that are much more happier to tell an original story than the days of the past where it must be IP. Series is kind of has to be based on some book, movie, something franchise from the past. So that's it. So basically the company, it's a creative agency because I don't know how much I'll delve into it here, but it also handles branded content. But I'll be developing TV and feature films from those 3 continents, taking in creators from all over the world who are very excited. The last 3-4 months has been me talking to investors, studios, creators, and streamers from all over the world, just in a virtuous circle of trying to work out which creators I want to work with, what stories they want to tell, which production companies can authentically tell that story, and then who is looking for that. And with the streamer part, yes, a lot of it will be done in those 3 continents. In a lot of cases, they can't pay the same amounts that Western streamers can. So there is an element of going to the global streamers. And what's great about global streamers is that they do want subscribers outside of the West.
Yeah.
Because that's where the growth market is.
That's where the growth is. Yeah.
That is where the growth market is. If I want to be super transparent about it, it's where the growth markets are. But if they are based in the US, for example, it won't actually be the reason their share price goes up and down. However much growth there is in the global majority, in my estimation, it doesn't tick the needle the way US or European subscriber rise or fall affects their share price. So in that case, it's not as important to them, but it's not going to be as important to me either. Like as I build these kind of relationships across continentally, I'm hoping that the strength of that allows me to tell stories with high production values that allows these stories to flourish. And the final point I'll make about it won't be the final point at all, but another point that I make is that basically what happens a lot in the past when I speak to these creators is that when they come to where they think the money is, they're asked to dilute their story. And so, and then nobody's happy. The creator's like, oh, I kind of got it on a platform, that's cool. But I was asked to include these topics to make it available, to make it seemingly more accessible to these people, when really they wanted to tell a very personal story. So I'm really keen to make sure that these stories stay specific and stay personal, because we always forget this, but those are the best stories. I was not working in the furnace of the Titanic, right? But I can somehow relate to Leonardo DiCaprio in that movie. I wasn't there, but somewhere along the line in a risk-averse environment, somebody would have said, "Oh, could he be someone else?" You know, you can very easily lose specificity and authenticity in any story because you forget. But I think that I intend to keep it in there, because if you tell a great story and somebody who hasn't experienced that can relate, loves it, they'll go and search up the parts that they don't understand. If you've done it well enough, they'll be the ones telling their parents, "Oh, did you know that this happens in this country?" And the parent will be like, "Oh, where did you even get that information?"
Yeah,
from that show. That's when it works really well. So I refuse to acknowledge that every story must revolve around the universal experience of some kid in a city, at a school, on a school bus. It just doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
No. And I think you mentioned those biases don't really embed until they're much older, but also they consume so voraciously. They're like sponges, aren't they? You know, and to that point that you've just said, they're so accepting and welcoming of this new information, because if it's new information, they can't wait to wear it like a badge and then go and tell their parents or go and tell their grandparents or display their knowledge of this thing. that they've just found out. And I think we've lost that a little bit along the way. We've lost that of, you know, of genuinely making kids light up or really just want to burst because they want to go and tell someone that they know this new thing.
Yeah.
I think that part of that is the kind of the insecurity of the industry, really, that they want to kind of bet on the safe bet. I mean, I'm so pleased that you kind of mentioned about your experience at Netflix as well, because it feels like Netflix sort of changed the game in one way. The paradox with Netflix, I always thought, was that they took really local stories that, because of their global platform, could be enormous hits, or kind of very, not even necessarily local, but very distinctive stories. Squid Games is like a perfect example.
You were right. You were right the first time. Very local, because the end game, the goals and objectives of those stories were to be hits in their market. But the nature of the platform means that they could go for gold. You could go for the world. Whereas before, I always give this example, and I'll give this example. Basically, there was a show that was made when I worked at Cartoon Network in Asia. We had 8 linear feeds for Cartoon Network, and we could put any show on in the region. Asia Pacific consisted of 8 linear feeds for different countries, covering different areas, and that was historically down to how many satellites was Ted Turner willing to put up in the sky to make money, right? So the bare minimum is 8. So you've got one satellite, which comically is like Southeast Asia. So it's like 16 countries, 16 cultures, probably more than 16 cultures, right? And one satellite is pointing at it, and it will say, the promo will come up and it will be like, Jakarta, 8 p.m., Bangkok, 9 p.m. And everyone in that region is just, okay, I guess I watch these shows now, and it was making money for them, and that's great. So we had a show that the India Cartoon Network India team made as an original with a studio in India, and we had the rights to the whole region for this show. It was called Chota Beam, and it was number 1 on Pogo and number 2 on Cartoon Network. Pogo being another Turner brand, a local Turner brand, and we were asked in Hong Kong, we've got the rights, why don't you put it on any of your feeds? So I was acquisitions, but I was also programming. And we were like, no, because, it's a local show. It's you guys. Great. We're really happy for you that you did that. But humans with biases at the top decided that show couldn't work outside of the Indian subcontinent, right? And then Netflix did a spin-off of that show, a younger version of Chota Beam, and called it Mighty Little Beam. And that show blew up everywhere in the world. And basically it was like, I can't find it because Netflix have changed their Instagram accounts. But when I first joined, it was actually the biggest international hit of the year. They used to say international. It was still, they were framed, Netflix still in 2019 when I joined, were just moving out of the world of framing themselves like a US media company who had like domestic and international. And so on this Instagram account they had, it was literally like, My Little Beam was the biggest international show of the year. All the originals that came out in 2019, there were 5 years into originals at that point. And that was a failing on our part as creatives in Hong Kong at Cartoon Network, using our biases to say local for this one, as opposed to, as you mentioned, local stories at Netflix that just had needed to please the market could just drop into the global water and make a splash. And about 8 or 10 or 12 of them did in my time there.
Amazing.
Which was part of the proof positive to me that there is no local for local, and that there is a generation. I mean, forget kids. Like if we just, even Gen Z is the same with their TikTok usage. We can talk about the algorithm of TikTok in a bit. Between Netflix and TikTok, these two services have intertwined to allow people to show content from anywhere with no center. There is no like a meta product kind of directs you slowly back to the US at every given take. Like other streaming services kind of directed you back to US IP because that's where they'd make the most money. But these other services, for that brief moment in time, I guess TikTok still does that, will show you what you want to see from your region. And therefore, watch time is just so much higher.
Interesting.
What digital trends have you seen across those regions in Asia that are interesting to you? What differences do you remark between how they consume content and entertainment versus over here?
There are a couple of things. One of them is, I mean, you mentioned it with anime, with the grief and the different storylines. I would say kids' content consumption is by age, by demo, is handled differently in Asia. And you see that in the what you see from anime, okay, come out. But even what we regard as preschool is watched in a different way. And then what we regard as comedy, what we regard as a 6 to 12 comedy, would actually be watched by the whole family and be in prime time in many parts of Asia, in Japan and Korea. So when you are in that region and trying to break out of it, it's quite hard because you either have to make a new and different edit of what you're doing, or you have a world of explanation to try and. You can see shows end up on adult platforms that are for kids in Japan. The example I'll give you is a show called Crayon Shin-chan, which is on 8:30 on like the equivalent of ITV in Japan, right? It's like The Simpsons. Let's just say it's like a family show, but it's a bit ruder, a bit more. I think ribald is the word. I don't know. Was it ribald? I don't know how to pronounce that word. So but basically, it's a little bit. It's got more oomph than The Simpsons. So that company, with a huge domestic market, takes it out of Japan, brings it to the West, and the West is like, absolutely not. That's crazy what that kid's doing in that show. And then it ends up on Hulu. Right. And then, so it ends up on Hulu for 3 or 4 seasons. And then I meet someone at that company, because we ended up making a spin-off of that show for Cartoon Network. But when I eventually meet someone from who's worked on Crayon Shin-chan, and I explain to him that Hulu is essentially bought it as adult animation, he's like, what? What? I just thought they bought it as animation. And I'm like, no, there's actually like a massive split. You're either this or this in the West, right? You're either like Adult Swim or you're Fox or you're on a kids channel, right? That's literally it. And it's just so much more fluid out there, which creates problems that are really interesting to solve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think the kind of completely delivery platform agnostic culture of kind of kids media now in some ways encourages more of that mix, that people are less like this is kind of this demographic that we should be watching this, whether it's shifted?
It's really tricky because I speak to parents who they're not going to watch anime. They're not going to watch it to check if it's okay for their kids, but they know something's up. They might walk past a TV or a screen and be like, whoa, what was that? So you do have to temper it if you want to be in control of when your kid learns about relationships and when they learn about grief and when they learn about all these different pieces. It's really, if you want to maintain that control, you should probably pay attention to that. But it is a real driver in helping kids emotionally grow.
Yeah. It makes me a little sad that we don't have those opportunities for co-viewing that perhaps still exists in Asia and in those markets, because it doesn't feel like we have those opportunities now. Like you said, you're either adult animation or you're adult comedy or you're kids, and they're all in different places. And we've almost devolved the responsibility for that. Go and watch your stuff over there, kids.
Yeah.
And I kind of lament the loss of those opportunities to co-view. I do wonder if now that YouTube is making big strides onto the connected TV, the big TV in the lounge room, we might have more of those opportunities for co-viewing coming back. Because
I think there are attempts at Netflix for sure, and maybe some other places as well, to do co-viewing. Again, the sex scenes aside, I think Arcane has been big on co-viewing with family. It's got cool battles if you don't fully understand what's going on, but it's also got some really cerebral and thought-provoking stories behind it that relate to the world today if you're an adult. There are attempts, but they're rare. And I think streaming will bring more of those co-viewing opportunities than linear. I think linear's a bit siloed at the moment in that regard, and that's fine. That's fine. 7 to 12, there is a market for that for sure, with European public broadcasters and the remainder of the streamers who still have room to launch a show, on their linear channels wherever possible. But yeah, I think I'm a big believer in co-viewing. When I mentioned earlier the pivot to movies, what we will be developing features as well as series. And I again, going back to metrics and stuff that I've seen, families will give a movie a chance. One of my theories for this, I keep saying it like it's gospel, but it's still just a theory of mine, is that I think there's a value proposition attached to watching a movie for families. I think there's a clear, either this is going to cost me £100, right? There's 2 of us, there's 2 kids, there's popcorn, there's all this stuff I have to do, or we watch this thing. And that actually removes the IP from it. Families, in that instance, will watch a a movie about something they haven't heard of.
Yeah.
I love that. I don't know if they'll do that even for IP with a series. That somehow we can really get into why that is. But I think when it's serious, people are like, harumph, how many episodes? How long is this going to take? So I'm watching this with my kids.
That's me.
Yeah.
I'm a commitment phobe with series.
Right.
Yeah. Particularly if you're a completist, you're kind of a bit like, I like to complete a series. What am I letting myself in for?
Yeah, I'd say there's a slight. I mean, if we could talk a little bit about adult like drama, I think adults have a similar thing around limited series. So I think limited series does a lot of heavy lifting that gets me to watch, and I don't know if you guys are the same. Limited series originally meant there's going to be someone who's quite a big star in this. They only do movies, but they've come to do this, a limited series. Well, you should tune in. That's what it used to mean. For me, limited series means a conclusion. Thank goodness. You're like, I'm going to watch this because it will be concluded. And funnily enough, I watched a limited series a few months ago that left a little thread hanging, and I was like, guys, no, you've broken that.
That's not what I signed up for.
Yeah. I still feel like the trust is broken in movies where the movie doesn't end and he's just like, oh no. Even like Wicked is just like, I need to watch the sequel now. You haven't given me a satisfying conclusion.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to think of something recently. I'm not going to think of it on this podcast. I was raging at something that just didn't end, and I was just like, I think that... Oh, do you know what it was? I'll tell you what it was. It was season 2 of Squid Game.
Oh, right. Yeah, that was a classic.
Of course, yes, because season 3 is coming.
I feel there's a phrase called trust busting. I feel like my trust was completely busted because season 1 is a complete thing, and when in Netflix's new world of releasing things in 2 drops, like that's fine, right? That's fine to have a gap, right, in a season, but to end it without completing the game of the Squid Games, that round of games, and have something not be a drop in a few weeks but be another year, I felt I felt like my trust had been broken again. Yeah,
it's kind of like, does that elastic band break?
Yeah. So going back to it, I think the movie. So that limited series one is for us, but like for kids, I genuinely feel there's a movie thing where it's like I can get my parents for 2 hours and we can watch this thing and all be entertained. And parents are up for that because that value proposition I mentioned earlier. And it's a lot harder with series to do that in this world.
I think you've got a great point. I think when parents are time poor, but they do genuinely want to spend some time with their kids. If it's something that is, it's going to be a complete story, and it might be something about which you'd not really thought before, or it's something new to consider, I would be much more likely to sit down and watch that with my kids than I would tuck into a new series, where I almost have to psych myself up for it. It's like getting ready for it, going out for a run. You've got to get yourself psyched up to go and complete this series. But I think you've got a really great point there. And I think, with the exception of, can we make them 90 minutes? Because I still struggle to sit through 2 hours.
Yeah.
But that's me.
Do you think,
I agree.
Do you think part of the thing with the movies is also, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, the audience or the producers, but do you think the producer's attitude is different? Because I was speaking to a producer that had experience doing series production, but was now focusing more on movies. And they said the difference between series production and movies was that he can work on a movie and he'll be making it for himself in the audience as well as everyone else.
Nice.
Whereas he says that when he was at series, you're very much, I'm making it for this demographic.
Right.
But for a movie, he was the demographic because it was a family.
You know what? I would say this person should have made the series for himself. Like, I genuinely feel that whether it's rewatch value or whatever, I think the trick that Bluey does well and Pixar have always done well is to layer it for adults and kids. And I feel like we do. I mentioned it earlier. I was like, cool, yeah, 7 to 12, linear channel, 4 p.m, great. But I'm also, why can't you throw in some grown-up jokes in that as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that going back, if you do watch that second, was it the first massive hits of Cartoon Network, the Dexter's Laboratory and the Johnny Bravo, they were made for themselves as well as the audience. They made them for themselves. Like, you watch them now and you're like, wait, what? How did I miss all of that? It's because you were 12 and they just sprinkled it just above your head. And if there was an adult present, maybe if there were no adults watching, they in the studio could get through the day by throwing in jokes for themselves. But it plays really well now. It stands the test of time beautifully.
Yeah, the ecosystem for all of the shows that created then was amazing.
Yeah. So that's does that all make sense? My venture, does that all, the size of the opportunity is planet Earth.
It's huge. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited for you.
Thank you.
My kids are a little bit older now, but one thing I really loved when they were younger, and mainly consumed through linear channels, and accepting that has changed. But we used to love those shows that did tell slightly different stories. And it didn't really matter what they were. It was just that different flavor. I'm remembering Tinga Tinga Tales, which was something that we absolutely loved. And we learned about Anansi and all of those stories were so interesting and amongst some of our favorites. So I'm really excited to see what creators and stories you unlock.
I'm excited too. As I keep saying to people, now I just need to execute. It was a good week at Kidscreen, and I got lots of good feedback and backing and support. And it's the next year is going to be, well, the year we're in now is going to be very exciting. I've also made noises about speeding up development times, and now I'm just like, I just want to rest.
And now you said it on the podcast.
I know. I said it on the podcast, but with a caveat of the I want to rest. But yeah, I think that being able to work more nimbly was part of the reason for going off and doing this venture, but also knowing deep down that there's an audience out there. Marrying that audience with the gatekeepers of TV right now and giving people something fresh to look at. My overall sense is of commissioners saying they want this, but when you take that exact thing to them, they're like, I mean that exact, and then saying, no, just being able to go out, do something and delight someone when you put it in front of them. Delight them and know that you love it as well is priceless, guys. It's priceless. It's like, I don't know I've done that before, and if I get to do that again with my own company, I genuinely feel like I'll have had the best career. It'll be fantastic to be able to just say, well, everything I did, I loved, and everybody could see that I loved it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you know what? We're right behind you, and we will be following the journey. We'd love to have you back on as things progress. Thank you for explaining a little bit more to us today. So I'm going to throw to you, Andy, to sign off.
Yeah, so thanks very much for that, Ed. And thanks for you guys for listening. And please like and subscribe on all the various platforms. And we'll see you next week.